It was one of those nights where the rain clung to the earth, drenching everything in a cold, suffocating mist. I was exhausted, every muscle in my body aching from the grueling shift at the factory, the kind of exhaustion that settles deep into your bones, makes your mind foggy, and leaves you feeling more like a machine than a man. I'd stopped at the diner out of routine, more than hunger. Just needed somewhere to sit, to let my mind idle while I nursed a cup of coffee. The place was nearly empty, just a few truckers huddled over their meals, the buzz of the neon sign outside flickering through the window. The waitress, with tired eyes and a crooked smile, leaned against the counter. Her face, like the diner itself, had seen better days. I barely noticed him at first, the man sitting in the booth a few spaces down, just at the edge of the shadows. Something about the way he seemed to blend into the darkness, almost like he was part of it, caught my eye. The only thing that stood out was his eyes, glinting, watching. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly turned my gaze back to the swirling coffee in front of me. But the feeling lingered, an uncomfortable sense of being watched. I could almost feel his stare, like a weight pressing down on me. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, a side effect of too many late shifts. But the unease wouldn't go away. I glanced back at him, just a quick peek. This time, our eyes met. It was like a punch to the gut. His eyes weren't just watching, they were probing, searching, piercing into me like needles, as though he could see straight through my skin and into my thoughts. My heart began to race, a slow thud echoing in my chest. There was something wrong about him. The air around him felt thick, almost suffocating. I quickly looked away, gripping my mug so hard my knuckles turned white. Breathe, I told myself. Just breathe. But I couldn't shake that feeling, that primal fear clawing at my insides. You all right, hon? I jumped, nearly knocking my coffee over. The waitress was standing beside me, her eyes filled with concern. I forced a smile, my heart still pounding. Yeah, I muttered. Just a long night. She gave me a nod but didn't seem convinced. As she walked away, I took a deep breath, trying to regain control. I couldn't stop myself from glancing back at the man's booth again. He was gone. For a moment, I just stared. The booth was empty. No coffee cup, no sign anyone had been sitting there at all. I scanned the diner, but he was nowhere. The truckers continued eating, the waitress now behind the counter, oblivious to the stranger's disappearance. I stood up quickly, throwing a crumpled bill onto the table, and hurried outside. The rain hit me like ice, soaking through my clothes instantly. I dashed to my car, fumbling with the keys as the wind whipped the cold rain into my face. As soon as I was inside, I locked the doors, breathing hard, the cold leather seats sending shivers down my spine. What the hell just happened? My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to calm myself. It was probably nothing. Maybe he'd slipped out when I wasn't paying attention. I repeated that thought over and over, trying to convince myself. I pulled out onto the road, the rain blurring the windshield as I drove through the storm. The highway was almost deserted, just the faint glow of the diner's sign fading into the distance behind me. I cranked up the heat, hoping it would take the edge off the cold that seemed to seep into my bones. But the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me. I couldn't shake the memory of his eyes. They weren't just watching me. It felt like they had followed me, like they were still with me. My heart raced again, an uneasy knot tightening in my chest. Suddenly the headlights flickered, the engine sputtering. I cursed under my breath as the car jerked, coming to a slow stop in the middle of the road. The rain was pounding now, a relentless wall of water battering the car. I tried to restart the engine. Nothing. Great. Just what I needed. I leaned back in my seat, letting out a frustrated sigh when I saw it. Movement. In the rearview mirror. My blood ran cold. Someone was standing in the road behind me, just far enough away that I couldn't see their face clearly. But I knew. Somehow I knew it was him, the man from the diner. He was just standing there, motionless, like a statue, staring at my car through the rain. My pulse quickened, every instinct screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But I was frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadowy figure started to walk toward the car, slow and deliberate, each step sending a jolt of terror through my body. His face, God, I couldn't see his face. But I could feel those eyes on me, the same eyes that had haunted me back at the diner. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed for help. But the line was dead. No signal. The rain hammered down, the darkness outside, swallowing everything. He was closer now, just a few feet away, his outline barely visible through the torrent. And then he stopped, just outside the driver's side window. I couldn't bring myself to look. Every fiber of my being told me not to look. But I did. He was right there, his face inches from the glass. Those eyes, hollow and endless, stared into mine. My chest tightened, breath catching in my throat as I felt the overwhelming pressure of his presence. I could barely think, paralyzed by the cold, relentless gaze. The car door handle rattled, and then... I never believed in ghosts. Growing up, I always figured those stories were just ways to keep kids in line. But one night changed everything. It was a rainy Wednesday when I first stumbled upon the Starlight Diner. Its neon sign flickered against the wet pavement, casting a faint glow into the empty street. I was new to the city, and the old-school vibe of the place drew me in. I needed something warm after a long day, and it seemed like the perfect spot to grab a bite and relax. As soon as I stepped inside, a wave of nostalgia hit me. The place felt frozen in time, like it hadn't changed in decades. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, and a jukebox in the corner quietly hummed old tunes. The smell of greasy fries and coffee filled the air. Despite its charm, the diner was practically deserted, save for a lone waitress wiping down tables near the back. "Sit wherever you like," she called over, without looking up. Her voice was flat, almost as if she was bored or distracted. I glanced around and settled into a booth near the window. The table felt a bit sticky under my hands, but I didn't care. I was too tired to notice. That's when I saw it. The booth across the room. It was just like any other, but something about it made my skin crawl. A feeling crept over me, like I shouldn't be looking at it. The upholstery was a darker red than the rest, and a small plaque on the wall above read, "The Blood-Stained Booth." I leaned over and asked the waitress when she came to take my order, "Why do they call it that?" She froze, her pen hovering above her notepad. For a second I thought she didn't hear me, but when her eyes met mine, they were wide and full of something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. "Don't sit there," she muttered under her breath, quickly scribbling down my order. "People don't like to talk about it. Just don't sit there." I let out a nervous laugh, thinking it was just some local superstition. Every old diner has its ghost stories, right? Still, her reaction left a bitter taste in my mouth. I glanced back at the booth. It looked normal enough. Just a worn-out piece of furniture with years of history attached to it. Yet, something about the dim lighting made the seat cushions seem darker. As I waited for my food, I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through local articles, hoping to find something about this so-called haunted booth. It didn't take long before I stumbled on a headline from years ago. "Tragic double murder at the Starlight Diner. Couple caught in crossfire." I clicked the link. The details were grisly. A young couple, days away from their wedding, had been enjoying a late-night snack when an argument broke out between two men at the counter. No one knew what started the fight, but it escalated fast. One of the men pulled out a gun and, in the chaos that followed, 2 shots went off. The couple, seated in the back booth, never stood a chance. They died instantly. It was that booth, the blood-stained booth. A cold shiver crawled up my spine, and I looked up just as my food arrived. I pushed the article out of my mind, telling myself it was just an old story. People love to blow things out of proportion. But the feeling of unease lingered. As I ate, the rain outside intensified, hammering against the windows. The diner was still quiet, save for the occasional clatter of dishes from the kitchen. But something felt wrong. The air seemed to grow colder, and I found myself glancing back at the booth again and again. Each time it felt like the shadows were creeping closer, darker, more menacing. The waitress had disappeared into the back, leaving me alone. Or at least, I thought I was alone. It started as a faint whisper, so soft I couldn't make out the words. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth, straining to hear. The whispering grew louder, circling the diner like an eerie wind. Then laughter, soft, playful, like children playing hide and seek. I turned my head toward the booth, my heart racing. The booth was empty, just as it had been all night, but the laughter continued, growing more distorted, more sinister. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The laughter stopped. I stood up, my legs shaky, and slowly made my way toward the blood-stained booth. Every step felt heavier than the last. As I approached, the air around me turned icy cold, so cold I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The lights above flickered, and I swore I saw something, a figure sitting in the booth. Just for a moment, it was there. A man, hunched over, with his head in his hands. I blinked, and he was gone. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to leave, to bolt for the door, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I reached out to touch the back of the booth, half expecting it to feel warm, but instead, the fabric was damp, sticky almost. I jerked my hand back and stared at my palm. It was red. Blood. A scream lodged in my throat, and I staggered backward, knocking over a chair in my panic. The whispers started again, louder this time, filling my head until I couldn't think. I spun around, searching for the waitress, but the diner was empty. The door to the kitchen was shut, and the rain outside drowned out any sound I might have heard. Suddenly, I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, but no one was there. I bolted for the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Just as I reached it, I heard one last thing, a soft, sorrowful voice. "Why did they take us?" It was so close, like someone whispering directly into my ear. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard. The blood-stained booth wasn't just a story. It was a warning, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what happened to those who didn't heed it. The roads stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by thick trees that seemed to close in the deeper I drove into the night. My GPS had stopped working miles ago, and all I had for company was the low hum of the truck and the static of the radio. I had been driving for hours, fatigue setting in, as the weight of the road pressed down on me. It wasn't the first time I'd been out here, in the middle of nowhere, chasing a delivery deadline. But tonight felt different. The air outside the truck windows felt heavier, like something was off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. I was starting to think about pulling over for the night when I saw it. A flickering neon sign up ahead. Rosie's Diner, it read. A sense of relief washed over me. I could use some coffee and maybe a slice of pie. anything to break the monotony. The diner stood alone, a relic from another time, its neon lights buzzing in the otherwise still night. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed how deserted the place seemed. No other cars, no lights except for the one illuminating the sign, but I was too tired to care. All I needed was caffeine to keep me going. I pushed open the diner door, and the old bell above it jingled faintly. The place was quiet. Too quiet. Rows of empty booths lined the walls, and the counter was spotless. But there wasn't a soul in sight. It was like I had stepped into a time capsule, frozen in the past. The smell of stale coffee hung in the air. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the emptiness. No answer. I glanced around again, feeling the weight of the silence press down on me. The only sound was the faint buzzing of the neon sign outside. I was about to leave when I saw her, a waitress moving quietly between the tables, wiping them down one by one. She wore an old-fashioned blue dress, the kind you'd see in a 50s diner, with a white apron tied neatly around her waist. Her long, dark hair hung over her face like a curtain, obscuring her features. Relief washed over me. "Excuse me, ma'am. Can I get a cup of coffee?" She didn't answer. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like she hadn't even heard me. I watched as she wiped down another table, her hands moving in the same circular motion, over and over again. "Ma'am?" I tried again, louder this time. Nothing. It was like I wasn't even there. Frustrated, I stood up from the booth and walked over to her. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The air around her seemed colder. I couldn't explain it, but there was this icy chill that clung to her presence. I was just a few feet away when I stopped in my tracks. Her uniform shimmered faintly, like it didn't quite belong in this world. My throat tightened, and an uneasy feeling crawled up my spine. Something wasn't right. I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the unease. "Look, I don't mean to bother you, but could I get some coffee?" She paused mid-wipe, her hand hovering over the table for a moment before she slowly turned toward me. My heart skipped a beat as I finally saw her face, or rather what should have been her face. Her hair parted just enough for me to glimpse pale, featureless skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth, blank flesh where her features should have been. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. What the hell was this? She didn't move. She just stood there, her head slightly tilted, as if studying me. The diner felt colder now, the air thick with something I couldn't describe, something old, something wrong. I took another step back, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. But as I turned toward the door, the lights flickered. The diner was suddenly plunged into darkness, and in that moment, I heard it. A low, soft whisper. It came from behind me, like someone was standing right at my shoulder. "Stay." The voice was faint, almost pleading. My blood turned to ice. I spun around, but the waitress was gone. The diner was empty again, the silence deafening. The darkness pressed in on me, and my pulse roared in my ears. I fumbled for the door, my hands shaking as I pushed it open and staggered into the night. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, and I ran to my truck, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I threw open the door, jumped inside, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, speeding out of the parking lot without looking back. As I tore down the road, the diner's neon sign faded in my rearview mirror. But that icy chill stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that I wasn't alone in that truck. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, and my stomach lurched. In the back seat, barely visible in the dim light, was the faint outline of a figure. A woman in a faded blue dress, her long hair hiding her face. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop on the empty highway. My breath caught in my throat as I turned around, but the back seat was empty. Nothing but shadows. But I knew what I had seen. I wasn't imagining it. I didn't stop driving until the diner was miles behind me, but the memory of that blank face haunted me the whole way. I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, out in the darkness, she was still there, waiting, watching, and maybe, just maybe, she wasn't done with me yet.